February 14th, 1986. 11:47 a.m. Kurfürstendamm, West Berlin. A Burger King manager named Dieter Hoffmann sat in a cramped back office reviewing applications for counter staff. Outside, shoppers moved through the glossy storefronts of capitalism's Showcase Boulevard, 3 kilometers from the wall. Hoffmann circled a name on the third resume: Klaus Reinhardt, 23. References from a youth hostel in Kreuzberg, available immediately. The handwriting was neat. The smile in the passport photo was ordinary. Hoffmann scheduled an interview for Monday. He had no idea he had just flagged a Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung operative whose real name was Stefan Vogel, whose mission was not to flip burgers, but to map the daily routines of American military personnel who frequented the restaurant, and whose employment file would later become Exhibit 11C in a classified debriefing that would force NATO to redesign security protocols for every fast food franchise within 5 kilometers of Allied installations. The Cold War turned West Berlin into a paradox, a capitalist island surrounded by communist territory, defended by foreign armies, policed by overlapping intelligence services, yet populated by ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives. By the mid-1980s, the city had settled into a tense equilibrium. The wall had stood for 25 years. Espionage was routine. The Stasi maintained an estimated network of over 10,000 informants in West Berlin alone, embedded in hotels, bars, universities, taxi companies, and yes, restaurants. The logic was simple: gather patterns, identify vulnerabilities, map networks. The targets were not always diplomats or generals. Sometimes they were sergeants who ordered Whoppers twice a week, secretaries who met friends for coffee, technicians who mentioned repair schedules while waiting for fries. The East German Ministry for State Security understood that intelligence was not always dramatic. It was cumulative, granular, patient. Burger King had opened its first West Berlin location in 1982, part of a wave of American franchises that symbolized Western prosperity and accessibility. The Kurfürstendamm branch became popular with off-duty U.S. soldiers from McNair Barracks and Tempelhof Air Base. They came in uniform, sometimes in civilian clothes, often in groups, talking freely in a space that felt familiar and safe. To the Stasi's Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, the Foreign Intelligence Directorate, this was a target-rich environment. The challenge was access. Western fast food chains conducted background checks, required work permits, and maintained employee records that could be audited by Allied authorities. Inserting an operative required a cover identity robust enough to survive scrutiny, but mundane enough to avoid triggering suspicion. The solution was to create a legend so ordinary it would be invisible. Stefan Vogel was born in Karl-Marx-Stadt in 1963, the son of a factory foreman and a schoolteacher. He was recruited by the Stasi at 19 while studying mechanical engineering at a technical college. His file noted high aptitude for detail retention, low ideological fervor, useful detachment. He was not a zealot. He was a pragmatist who understood that cooperation offered advantages: travel, status, access to Western goods. His handlers trained him in observational protocols, memory techniques, and the construction of plausible cover stories. In 1985, he was given a new identity: Klaus Reinhardt, an ethnic German from a family that had emigrated from Silesia, raised in East Berlin, but recently relocated to the West via a family reunification visa. The documents were flawless: birth certificate, school records, a work history at a state-run cafeteria, even a reference letter from a fictional supervisor. The Stasi had spent months building the legend, knowing that a single inconsistency could unravel the operation. Vogel crossed into West Berlin in November 1985 through Checkpoint Charlie, carrying a single suitcase and a forged letter of invitation from a distant cousin. He moved into a shared apartment in Kreuzberg, a neighborhood dense with immigrants, students, and transients, a place where newcomers were common and questions were few. He registered with the local authorities, obtained a work permit, and began applying for jobs in the service sector. His instructions were explicit: seek employment in establishments frequented by American military personnel, avoid political discussions, maintain a low profile, and report observations weekly through a dead drop in Tiergarten. The target list included 3 bars, 2 cafes, and the Burger King on Kurfürstendamm. The Burger King was priority 1. It was close to McNair Barracks, open late, and staffed by a rotating crew of part-timers who rarely stayed longer than 6 months. Turnover was high. Scrutiny was minimal. Dieter Hoffmann had managed the Kurfürstendamm Burger King for 4 years. He was 41, a West Berliner who had worked his way up from fry cook to shift supervisor to manager. His concerns were practical: staffing shortages, inventory costs, health inspections, and the occasional drunk customer. He was not trained in counterintelligence. He did not think in terms of operational security. When Klaus Reinhardt walked into his office on February 17, 1986, for the interview, Hoffmann saw a polite young man with clean hands and a willingness to work nights. Reinhardt's German was fluent. His references checked out. Hoffmann had called the youth hostel, and a woman confirmed that Reinhardt had stayed there and worked kitchen shifts, and his availability was perfect. Hoffmann hired him on the spot. Reinhardt started the following Monday, assigned to the evening shift, 4 nights a week, 6 p.m. to midnight. Vogel's mission was not to steal documents or recruit agents. It was to observe and record. His targets were patterns: which units frequented the restaurant, what times they arrived, whether they came in uniform or civilian clothes, how many per group, what they discussed, whether they mentioned upcoming deployments, training schedules, or equipment issues. The Stasi had trained him to listen without appearing to listen, to remember faces and insignia, to note details that seemed trivial but could be cross-referenced with other intelligence streams. A sergeant mentioning a generator repair at Tempelhof, a specialist complaining about a delayed flight to Ramstein, a lieutenant joking about a security briefing scheduled for Thursday. None of it was classified. All of it was useful. Vogel worked the counter and the dining area, wiping tables, refilling napkin dispensers, clearing trays. He was friendly but not intrusive, efficient but not memorable. He learned the regulars' orders, their nicknames, their routines. He noted that a group of MPs came in every Wednesday around 8 p.m., that a signals unit from McNair favored the corner booth, that a logistics sergeant named Williams always ordered a double Whopper with extra pickles and often brought paperwork to review while he ate. Vogel never asked questions. He simply listened, watched, and remembered. Once a week, on his day off, he walked through Tiergarten, stopped at a specific bench near the Soviet War Memorial, and left a folded newspaper in a trash bin. Inside the newspaper was a handwritten summary, encoded using a simple substitution cipher, detailing names, units, schedules, and overheard conversations. A Stasi courier retrieved the drop within an hour. The operation ran smoothly for 7 months. Vogel's reports were consistent, detailed, and actionable. The Stasi correlated his observations with signals intelligence, satellite imagery, and reports from other sources, building a composite picture of American military activity in West Berlin. They identified shift patterns, supply routes, communication protocols, and personnel rotations. None of it was dramatic. All of it was valuable. Vogel remained undetected because he was exactly what he appeared to be: a competent, unremarkable fast food worker. Hoffmann never suspected. The American soldiers never suspected. The operation succeeded because it was designed to be invisible. But invisibility has limits. In September 1986, a U.S. Army counterintelligence analyst named Captain Laura Keene was reviewing anomaly reports from the Berlin field station. Her job was to identify patterns in seemingly unrelated incidents: lost ID badges, overheard conversations, unusual surveillance activity. One report caught her attention. A bartender at a club near McNair had been arrested for selling information to the Stasi. During his debriefing, he mentioned that the Stasi had expressed interest in routine locations frequented by American personnel, specifically mentioning fast food restaurants. Keene cross-referenced the list of establishments within 2 kilometers of McNair barracks. Burger King on Kurfürstendamm was on the list. She requested employee records from the franchise's regional office. The request was routine, framed as a security audit. The records arrived within a week. Keene reviewed the files with a checklist developed by Army intelligence: recent hires, employees with East German backgrounds, individuals with minimal verifiable history in West Berlin, anyone who had started working within the past year. Klaus Reinhardt's file triggered 3 flags. His references were thin. His employment history prior to West Berlin was vague. His residential address was in Kreuzberg, a neighborhood known for transient populations and limited social cohesion, ideal for someone seeking anonymity. Keene escalated the file to the Berlin Brigade's Intelligence and Security Division. They ran Reinhardt's name and documentation through Allied databases. The birth certificate was genuine, but the school records contained a discrepancy. The technical college listed on his resume had no record of a Klaus Reinhardt enrolled between 1980 and 1984. The reference letter from the cafeteria supervisor was signed by a woman whose signature appeared on 17 other reference letters submitted to various West Berlin employers over the past 3 years. A known Stasi tactic. The decision was made to place Reinhardt under surveillance without alerting him or his employer. On October 3, 1986, a joint team from U.S. Army intelligence and the West Berlin police began monitoring his movements. They observed him working his shifts, commuting to and from Kreuzberg, shopping at local markets. On October 9th, they followed him to Tiergarten. He walked to a bench near the Soviet War Memorial, sat for 3 minutes, then deposited a folded newspaper in a trash bin. He left. 12 minutes later, a man in a gray coat retrieved the newspaper. The surveillance team photographed the exchange. The man in the gray coat was identified as a known Stasi courier operating out of the East German trade mission. The newspaper was intercepted before it could be passed further. Inside was a coded summary of American personnel movements, unit identifications, and overheard scheduling details. The handwriting matched samples taken from Reinhardt's employment application. Reinhardt was arrested on October 14, 1986, at 6:22 a.m. in his Kreuzberg apartment by West Berlin police and U.S. Army counterintelligence agents. He did not resist. His apartment was searched. Investigators found a second identity card under a loose floorboard, this one bearing his real name, Stefan Vogel, and an East German address. They found a notebook containing coded entries matching the format of the intercepted reports. They found a contact protocol outlining dead drop locations, courier signals, and emergency exfiltration procedures. Vogel was transferred to a U.S. military detention facility and debriefed over the course of 6 weeks. He cooperated fully, providing details on his recruitment, training, mission parameters, and the intelligence he had collected. He identified his handlers, described the Stasi's operational priorities in West Berlin, and confirmed that the Burger King operation was one of several similar insertions targeting service sector jobs near Allied installations. Dieter Hoffmann learned of the arrest from a West Berlin police detective who arrived at the restaurant on October 15th to collect employment records and interview staff. Hoffmann was stunned. He had worked alongside Reinhardt, Vogel, for 7 months. had trusted him with cash register duties, had recommended him for a raise. The detective explained that Vogel had been a trained intelligence operative, that his entire identity had been fabricated, that every shift he worked had been an intelligence-gathering mission. Hoffman asked if he had done anything wrong, if he should have noticed something. The detective said no. The operation had been designed to be undetectable. Hoffman was a manager, not a counterintelligence officer. The fault was not his. But Hoffman never stopped wondering. He replayed conversations, reviewed schedules, searched his memory for signs he might have missed. He found none. That was the point. The fallout was immediate and procedural. NATO security officials conducted a comprehensive review of service sector employment practices near Allied installations. New protocols were implemented requiring enhanced background checks for employees at restaurants, bars, and retail establishments within designated security zones. Franchise operators were briefed on indicators of potential intelligence activity and instructed to report anomalies to military liaison offices. The Burger King on Kurfürstendamm remained open, but employee turnover spiked as workers were re-vetted and some were quietly dismissed due to documentation irregularities. The Stasi's network in West Berlin contracted. Several other operatives were identified and expelled. The operation's exposure forced the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung to shift tactics, moving away from long-term service sector insertions toward shorter-term, higher-risk operations. Vogel was held in U.S. custody for 9 months, then transferred to West German authorities and charged under the Federal Republic's espionage statutes. He was tried in a closed proceeding in Berlin's Moabit courthouse in August 1987. The evidence was overwhelming. The intercepted reports, the false identity documents, his own debriefing testimony. He was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison. He served 5 years before being released in a prisoner exchange in 1992, part of a post-reunification agreement that repatriated dozens of former Stasi operatives. He returned to what was now simply Germany, no longer divided, and disappeared into civilian life. Attempts to locate him for interviews in the years following reunification were unsuccessful. His Stasi file, declassified in 1998, confirmed the details of the operation and revealed that he had been one of 43 operatives inserted into West Berlin service sector jobs between 1983 and 1987. Only 6 were ever detected. Dieter Hoffmann continued managing the Kurfürstendamm Burger King until 1991, when the franchise was sold to a new operator. He moved to Hamburg and opened a small cafe. In a 2003 interview with a German journalist researching Cold War espionage in Berlin, Hoffmann said he still thought about Klaus Reinhardt, Stefan Vogel, occasionally, especially when training new employees. He said the experience taught him that trust is a vulnerability, that ordinariness is a disguise, and that the Cold War was not fought only in embassies and bunkers, but also in break rooms and dining areas, in places where people assumed they were safe because the stakes seemed low. He said he never blamed himself, but he never forgot either. The Burger King operation is a case study in the Stasi's operational philosophy. Intelligence is not always about high-value targets or dramatic breaches. It is often about accumulation, about gathering fragments that seem insignificant in isolation, but become actionable when aggregated and cross-referenced. The Stasi understood that soldiers talk, that routines reveal patterns, that even casual conversations can expose vulnerabilities. They understood that the best cover is not elaborate, it is mundane. A young man working a counter job, polite and unremarkable, invisible because he fit perfectly into the landscape of ordinary life. The operation succeeded for 7 months, not because Vogel was a master spy, but because he was a competent employee in a context where competence was expected and suspicion was not. The case also illustrates the limits of defensive counterintelligence in open societies. West Berlin was a city of constant movement. Refugees, students, workers, visitors. Background checks were conducted, but they relied on documentation that could be forged, references that could be fabricated, histories that could be invented. The Stasi exploited this openness systematically, understanding that democratic societies prioritize freedom of movement and employment over total security. The tension was structural. The West could not seal itself off without abandoning the principles it claimed to defend, but every opening was a potential vulnerability. The Stasi did not need to break into embassies when they could walk through the front door of a Burger King. What remains unknown is the full scope of the intelligence Vogel collected and how it was used. His debriefing reports were classified and remain partially redacted. The Stasi files confirmed that his observations were correlated with other sources, but the specific operational outcomes, whether his reports contributed to surveillance operations, recruitment targeting, or contingency planning, are not detailed in the declassified materials. It is known that the Stasi maintained extensive dossiers on American military personnel in Berlin, tracking movements, relationships, and routines with the goal of identifying recruitment opportunities or operational weaknesses. Vogel's reports likely fed into this larger apparatus, adding granular detail to profiles that were already being built through signals intelligence, photographic surveillance, and informant networks. The broader question is what the operation reveals about the nature of espionage in the late Cold War. By the mid-1980s, the ideological certainties of the 1950s and 1960s had eroded. The wall was permanent. Détente had failed. Both sides understood that the conflict would not be resolved through dramatic confrontation, but through attrition, through the slow accumulation of advantages and the patient exploitation of weaknesses. Espionage became less about stealing secrets that would change the balance of power and more about maintaining situational awareness, about knowing what the other side was doing, where they were vulnerable, how they thought. The Burger King operation was not designed to prevent a war or win a war. It was designed to give the Stasi a marginal edge, a slightly clearer picture, a few more data points to feed into their analytical machinery. The human cost was diffuse but real. Vogel spent 5 years in prison. Hoffman spent decades questioning his judgment. The American soldiers who frequented the restaurant learned that a space they had considered safe was compromised, that their casual conversations had been monitored, that their routines had been catalogued. The trust that makes ordinary social interaction possible was damaged. The operation's exposure did not prevent future espionage, but it added another layer of suspicion, another protocol, another barrier between people trying to live normal lives in an abnormal city. The case also raises the question of what might have happened if Vogel had not been detected. How long could the operation have continued? Would he have been reassigned to a different location, a different mission? Would the Stasi have expanded the program, inserting more operatives into more service sector jobs, building a network that could have persisted for years? The declassified files suggest that the Stasi had planned to run the operation indefinitely, rotating Vogel out only if his cover was at risk or if a higher priority mission required his skills. The exposure in October 1986 was not the result of a flaw in the operation's design, but of an unrelated arrest that triggered a broader audit. The operation failed not because it was poorly executed, but because the system it was embedded in, the vast overlapping network of intelligence and counterintelligence activities in Cold War Berlin, eventually produced a collision. In the end, the Burger King operation was both exceptional and routine. Exceptional in its audacity. The idea of embedding a trained intelligence operative in a fast food restaurant to spy on soldiers ordering lunch. Routine in its execution. the patient construction of a cover identity, the methodical collection of observational data, the disciplined adherence to tradecraft. It succeeded because it was designed to be invisible, and it failed because invisibility is never absolute. Someone is always watching, someone is always checking, someone is always asking questions. The Cold War was fought in the shadows, but the shadows were never empty. They were crowded with people like Stefan Vogel and Dieter Hoffmann and Laura Keene, each playing a role in a system they only partially understood, each making decisions that seemed small but carried consequences they could not foresee. The Burger King on Kurfürstendamm is still there, though it has been renovated several times, and is now managed by a corporation that did not exist when Vogel worked the counter. The wall is gone. The Stasi is gone. The Cold War is over. But the case file remains, archived in Berlin and Washington, a record of a moment when the ordinary and the covert intersected, when a manager hired a spy without knowing it, when a young man flipped burgers and gathered intelligence, when the stakes were both enormous and invisible. The file is a reminder that espionage is not always about high-tech surveillance or dramatic betrayals. Sometimes it is about a folded newspaper in a trash bin, a polite smile at a counter, a routine that seemed safe until it was not. The question that remains is not whether it could happen again, but whether it is happening now, in places we assume are too ordinary to matter, by people we assume are too unremarkable to notice.